Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us in this presentation of signs and symptoms, or is I is or is I ain't. At the end of this presentation, I'd like for you to take advantage of the online assessment tool that we've provided, which will give you an opportunity to take a look and see where you might be in all of this, or if you or someone you love may have a problem. Again, thanks again, and we'll move on to the next segment. Well, what we're going to do in this segment, this is where we're going to start taking a look at is I is or is I ain't, just to kind of recap for a minute. Again, addiction has nothing to do with what the person's doing, when they do it, where they're from, where they're doing it, why they're doing it, who they are. It has everything to do with how it affects them when they do it. We're going to spend this little portion talking about early stage symptoms. And if you remember in the last segment, we talked about very easy to understand why early stage addiction would be so hard to diagnose. Again, it's not the quiet before the storm. The storm is there. It's just very hard to see, very hard to tease out. Okay? One of the things that we're going to look at, and a little personal insight here. I use me. I won't tell you all the stories that I have related to some of these, but I might give you a story now and then. I learned a long time ago there's two ways to learn. Okay? Some people can learn and be very, very comfortable with reading about something. Some of us have to have a visual, kind of an example. I tell folks all the time, I'm the kind of guy that if you give me a technical manual and come back a week later, I'm dumber than when you gave it to me. I just don't learn that way anymore. Show me how to do something. Show me what it looks like or how it's supposed to work. I can pick up pretty quick. And I think in addiction and alcoholism and other addictions as well, sometimes reading about a symptom might give you a little bit of insight, but I think sometimes seeing it in somebody else's life, it's one of the most important things why, again, those of us in recovery that go to meetings, not that discussion meetings and other types of meetings aren't important, but I think for a lot of people early on, speakers meetings can be so important because the person's getting an opportunity to hear the situation in somebody else's life and maybe identify in and that type of thing. So some of us learn by reading a list. Some of us have to have a little bit more of a face put on it. So I'll use my situation through some of these. Like I said, early stage addiction is very, very difficult to diagnose. I want to show you why. When I do this in an education setting, in one of my just basic education groups, when I do this particular topic, I will ask, and I tell people, keep an open mind, because for those that addiction isn't a problem, you may see some of your behavior in this as well. And I always ask a question, or a series of questions. First question I ask is, and I'll ask everybody in here, is there anybody in here who drinks, drank, used, whatever, in an attempt to relax? And most people certainly raise their hand and say, well, yeah, at one time I certainly did. Okay. Well, the first symptom of early stage alcoholism is the person starts to drink to calm their nerves. So you look at, 90% of the people in the room will put their hands up and it's like, well, geez, I'm 1 for 1. Yeah, I drink to relax. Okay. It's the reward at the end of a bad day, that type of thing. Well, again, the number one symptom is a person drinks to calm their nerves. I tell people don't panic. It's not the occurrence, it's the frequency. Alcohol is probably the greatest stress management tool we have, except for those of us that eventually over time, it starts to create the very thing we're trying to deal with. One of my definitions, again, of addiction is when the cure for the problems becomes the cause. That's when we have to take a look, like I said earlier. So here, it's certainly, for most people that drink, they'll mention that they started to drink to relax. Okay. Again, if you do a survey, if you walk down the mall and asked 100 people randomly, do they drink, did they drink, have they drank, whatever their pattern may be, okay, about 90% or 85% of those 100 people will say, yes, they did, yes, they do at some time in their life. Again, if you ask those 80 or 85 that say yes, if you ask them why, about 90% is going to tell you, again, to relax. Again, it's a great stress management tool. Okay? If you ask those same folks, and I'll ask this question in a group, for those of you that drank in an attempt to relax or as a stress management tool, is there anybody in here that it takes a little bit more to do the same thing than maybe it did 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago? And most people say, well, yeah, a little. Okay. Second symptom is an increase in tolerance. And that's what that means. It takes more to do the same thing. Now you look at that and go, oh my God, I'm 2 for 2. Maybe it is more of a problem than I thought. Okay? There's a difference, and I want to stop and do a little example here with this to compare two people. If you take the social drinker and the alcoholic, I'll compare the social drinker to my pattern when I was still drinking. Okay? Here you have a person, and I tell or ask folks in the education groups, go back and it can do it in here too, go back and think about the first time you ever took a drink. What happened? And most people will say, well, I got sick, I got dizzy, I got silly, I fell asleep. There was some result or consequence as a result of that first episode, that first experience. Okay? So here you have, and then you ask them, how about that second experience? Well, halfway through that first drink, I got sick, and on and on and on. And then you ask them about the third experience, and it might be days apart, might be months apart. Okay? They say, well, same thing happened. And then you ask them, how about a little later on? And then what you see is a person says, well, I noticed that first one I got through and got exactly what I was looking for, and halfway into that second one, I got sleepy, I got sick, I got goofy, wanted to fight everybody in the bar, whatever it might have been. So now you're seeing it takes a little more to do the same thing. And maybe you might even see another situation where maybe it takes a little bit more. Oops, you can cut that part out. So here we have an increase in tolerance where it's taken a little more to do the same thing over time. That's not a function of addiction. That's a function of chemistry. It's a function of biology. If you have a headache and you take an aspirin and it goes away and then it comes back, and you take another one, it goes away and comes back, maybe you have to take 2, then eventually you have to take extra strength Tylenol. It takes a little more to do the same thing. Every so often, you may have, and what you'll see for the social drinker, he or she will stay within this range. In fact, people have a name for it. People will talk about, 2 or 3 is my limit. Any more than that, I know all bets are off. And they'll stay, for the most part, somewhere within that limit. There'll be the occasional blowout, maybe. Birthday, anniversary, New Year's Eve, something along those lines. Well, maybe the person has 5 or 6. They wake up the next morning and go, oh my God, I'll never do that again. And they don't. Their next drinking experience, they're back somewhere in that range. Okay? The social drinker's use increases a little, plateaus off, increases, plateaus off, and then gets to a point where it pretty much stays within those boundaries. Okay? Watch the alcoholic. Go back to my situation. Okay? First time I ever took a drink. Okay? I tell people hindsight is a wonderful thing. You all know that old saying. Well, I'm kind of a living proof of that. I remember when I was growing up, 2 things my parents told me not to do. Don't smoke, don't drink. Well, being the inquiring minds want to know, the first thing is why not? So you got to sneak out and find out. First time I smoked a cigarette, I got sick as a dog, and I never smoked another one. First time I took a drink, I got sick as a dog. And something in there, that one little brain cell fired up and says, that's nasty, but you'll learn. And I couldn't wait to get sick again. So the pattern was starting to be laid out. So just like this person here, this social drinker, first drink I took, I got sick. Next drink, next experience, same thing. And I plateaued. And what changes in addiction, instead of that plateau leveling off and staying within that range with maybe the blowout, it becomes more steadily or increases steadily and gets more and more and more. I tell people it's not a very clinical tool, but if you have a friend who tells you when you get together, well, 2 or 3 is my limit. Then you see them 4 or 5 months later. Well, 5 or 6 is my limit. And then a year later, 15 or 20 is my limit. Now all of a sudden you're looking at a whole different tolerance increases to a point, and then kind of levels off. For the alcoholic, it's steadily going up. There's only one time does that change, and we'll look at that later on this evening when we look at late stage addiction and how when I finally, to give you a little preview of that, in late stage alcoholism, there's a decrease in tolerance. And I remember telling myself, because I'm watching everybody having 1 or 2 and 3 or 4, and I'm drinking, like there's no tomorrow. After a while, it got to the point where I could have a couple and I'd pass out. And I started telling myself, maybe I'm finally learning how to drink. I'm drinking like everybody else. He or she's having 2 or 3, I'm having 2 or 3, and I wasn't learning how to live. I wasn't learning how to drink. I was learning how to die. Towards the end of late stage addiction, what you start to see, I would tell people I'm getting more bang for my buck. And literally, without realizing it, that's exactly what was happening. My liver wasn't detoxing at the rate it normally would detox at. So it was staying in the system for a little longer. We were talking in a session not too long ago in group about blood alcohol level. And one of the constants that we see, alcohol detoxes at the rate of 1 ounce per hour. And that's a constant. You can't speed that up. You can't slow it down. The only time it doesn't work by that little formula is when there's liver involvement and the liver can't. And you see all these patterns of the liver's basically doing the best it can. So again, in late stage addiction, I was getting more bang for my buck, but that wasn't a good thing. Okay? So here we have people where I say, okay, you drink to calm your nerves, you drink to relax. It takes a little bit more to do the same thing over time. Again, you're 2 for 2. Then I'll throw people a curve and I'll ask them, is there anybody in here who's ever had one for the road? Well, got a lot of hands go up and people, oh yeah. The third symptom of early stage alcoholism is a desire to continue drinking after everybody else has stopped. Okay? That's having one for the road. Again, with these symptoms, now when we look at middle stage and late stage, all this, all bets are off with this. But in early stage, it's not the occurrence, it's the frequency. Social drinkers have this happen from time to time, okay? I use as an example also, again, it's not a very clinical one, but I think it gets the point across. People go into a bar, and you'll see them and, sitting there, and they're having a good time and having a couple of drinks with friends, and all of a sudden the bartender calls last call. Well, you see a couple of different behaviors. The bartender calls last call. You're going to have some of the people sit there, look at their watch and go, oh my God, I'm in trouble. I got to get home. I didn't realize it was that late. You'll have a couple people who will look down and go, well, it is getting late. See y'all next time. And they get up and leave. And these are the people that I never could quite understand because they would leave half a pitcher of beer, half a bottle. To me, that was a sin. Okay, that was wasteful. Okay, that's a whole nother story. We'll talk about that in another episode. There's always somebody sitting there when last call is called, he or she will go up to the bar, order a round of drinks for the table, and they're sitting by themselves. Okay? Like I said, that's not a clinical determiner or factor. But again, when you're buying 3 or 4 and nobody's sitting there but you, that's a desire to continue using after everybody else has stopped. In addiction, we see a spin on this. Now, occasionally, you may hear a social drinker make a statement like this. We've probably all had this happen, even though we probably wouldn't admit it out loud. You go into somebody's house for dinner or a party, and you can't stand them. You'd rather poke yourself in the eye with a stick, but you got to go. So you have 1 or 2 just to kind of fortify to be able to stand going. In addiction, in active alcoholism, even early on, you start to see not only is there a desire to continue drinking after everybody else has stopped, there's the need to start drinking before everybody else has started. That sense of priming the pump and that type of thing. Okay? So now we have a situation where the first 3 symptoms are drink to calm down, takes more to do the same thing. There's a desire to continue using after, there's one for the road. Again, people look and go, well, that's just great. I thought I didn't have a problem, and now I'm 3 for 3. We know there's got to be more to it than that. Okay? The next symptom is one where you start to separate a little bit. Okay? But social drinkers will have this experience too. The person becomes uncomfortable in situations where drinking's not allowed for whatever reason. I like to use as an example with this. Suppose you go home in a little bit and you get your mail in. And you're going through the mail, pardon me, and you get to an envelope that looks very familiar size, and you know that it's an invitation for something. And you open it up, and you start reading, maybe it's a wedding invitation. Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so is proud to announce, XYZ and on all the details. And then there's a little space. The service will be held at 10 o'clock in the morning at such and such church, such and such, hall, whatever. A reception will follow, and the information where the reception is, okay? And you're reading down through this, and then you get towards the bottom, and you see those god-awful words. This will be a dry reception. Well, most people look at that, and the first thing might be, well, those cheap SOBs, that's... But you're not going to not go. Maybe it's a nephew or a niece or your best friend or a cousin. You might not like the fact that it's going to be a dry reception, but you're not going to not go. That's not the main purpose. Okay? Watch what the alcoholic does, even this early. I'd get home, I'd get an invitation, on and on, so-and-so's happy to announce, on and on and on. It's going to be a dry reception. Instead of me making some comment about him or her, I'd immediately look back to the top of the invitation to see when this thing was and how much time do I have to get out of going to this. Okay? That's being uncomfortable in a situation where alcohol is not available to a point where you start to alter the environment. This is where the person starts to take their own, the bottle under the front seat. And again, you see how early this stuff starts to show up. One of the things that we'll talk about as well, and you'll see this as we go through the other stages of alcoholism, when we cross from one stage into the next, we don't just pick up the new stuff. What happens is the person picks up the new stuff, drags in all the old stuff from the previous stage, and that intensifies. So in middle and late stage, you'll see some of the same stuff. It's just worse. So again, it grows. That's why we talk about addiction as a progressive illness. And that just means it gets worse over time. Okay? So here we have a person who's uncomfortable in situations where drinking's not allowed. But at this point, the social person, he or she's not going to alter the environment. They're not going to come up with reasons why they can't go or take your own, and that unless it is a bring your own type of thing. You're going to go. It's not a major factor. You'll see a difference in late stage when we talk about this as well. Again, the alcoholic is going to do everything he or she can to kind of work around that. Where there's a will, there's a way. Okay? The next one, and this is another one that social drinkers will experience too. I'll ask people, I said, now those of you, again, who've answered yes to most of these and, and kind of in a panic that maybe it is more of a problem than I thought. Here's another one that might set you back a little bit. Anybody ever wake up in the morning with a hangover and a little hair of the dog that bit you? Maybe a Bloody Mary or a sip of beer or something. A lot of people, well, yeah, occasionally. Okay. The next symptom is relief drinking begins. And relief drinking is when the person, what I'm using to fix the problem, starts to become the thing that creates the problem. So here the person is drinking or using. Again, a lot of these symptoms are universal in other drugs of choice and situations. Here the person starts to drink just a little in the morning to take the edge off the consequence of the drinking the day before. Now again, the problem, and you'll see this one show up in every stage, when what I'm using to fix the problem becomes the cause of the problem. I used to tell people all the time, my God, if you had my job, you'd drink too. And I always want people to understand I wasn't doing this kind of work. Okay, this is a completely different life for me. But I would tell people, my God, if you had the stress in my life and my job, you'd drink. Well, very often people would kind of be okay with that because they could look at a point in their life and say, oh yeah, I've done that. I've had that happen. Problem I had was the stress I was drinking over that day was brought on by the fact that I didn't show up for work at all the day before. And I didn't show up the day before because I was too busy taking care of the stress that was created 3 days before that because the drinking was creating the problem. So here relief drinking is an occasional, again, a little like the old, corny adage again, a little hair of the dog that bit you, a little something to take the edge off, okay? Here it starts to take on a whole different perspective here. The next one, and we've all done this, social drinkers too, and I have to admit when I saw this this afternoon, because I wrote this up this morning, there's occasional memory lapses. And after I looked at this again, I thought, well, I might be sober, but my spelling certainly hasn't improved any. There's only one S in occasional. I forgot. So this is a very unfair situation. Everybody's, again, I tell my DWI folks as an example, in the fourth part, we're going to talk about my little brain guy and talk about why irrational behaviors start and that type of thing. Well, one of the things that's housed in the part of the brain that gets knocked offline first is short-term memory. And I'll tell my DWI folks, you don't have to be alcoholic to have this situation happen. Very often you hear people say, well, I'm doing okay, I'm doing fine, I had a plan. I'm not going to find myself in this situation. I've had too much to drink, so I'm going to call somebody, get a cab, spend the night, I'll walk. Well, all of a sudden, the part that controls reason and judgment that says, now put that plan into place, is the first thing that gets knocked offline. And then short-term memory. Maybe the person doesn't remember making that plan. It was a good one at the time. I hear so often people say, I'm doing okay, I know I can make it home, just as soon as I can remember where I parked the car, or as soon as I can find my keys and they've got them in their hand, that type of thing. I've always thought this is one of those cruel trick of nature, or God's got a very bizarre sense of humor. Again, first part of the brain that gets knocked offline is the part that controls a lot of things that we'll look at in another segment. But again, short-term memory is housed in there. The first part of the brain that gets knocked offline through active use, not even addiction, just use, is the last part that comes back online. So here we have a thing where our short-term memory gets kind of shoved aside. We start to get sober, and short-term memory starts to come back online. And then age kicks in, and we start to lose it again. So there's kind of that little window of opportunity that's there. So again, like I said, it's kind of a cruel trick of nature. So here we have this occasional memory loss, not to the degree that we're going to look at in middle stage and certainly in late stage. Okay. The next one that we talk about is what they call a preoccupation with alcohol. This is where it's not, and again, you'll see this one show up in a great way in late stage. In fact, the whole stage of late stage alcoholism revolves around this. Okay, and you'll see why when we do that here in a little bit. This preoccupation is where the person, and every so often you may have the social drinker that's sitting there and you've got plans after work and the clock is moving backwards and it's kind of, God, are we ever, and then you do the old, it's 5 o'clock somewhere and, out the door you go. There may be those occasional times where the person is really just, is the day ever going to end? I want to go out and have a cold one. I want to be with friends. I want to do. Social drinkers do that occasionally. Alcoholics start to do it again all the time. Another Father Martin old adage, he used to always ask people, ask yourself one question: do normal drinkers do this? And if the answer is no, you need to take a look at what's going on. Social, normal, if you want to use that word, there may be that occasional thought of, again, the clock's not moving fast enough. The alcoholic starts to get, and this is in later stages, the person has such a preoccupation with alcohol, it really becomes this situation where you have to alter the environment to be able to get what I want when I want. Most people are certainly familiar with the fact, and if you're not, alcoholism is a compulsive disease as well. It's a physical illness, but the psychiatric mental health piece of it, it's a compulsive illness. And the compulsive person wants what I want when I want it, and that's right now. So now all of a sudden there's this preoccupation. Very often you'll hear people in recovery, they'll talk about the desire to drink has been removed, the compulsion to drink has been removed. If you look at addiction in another sense, again in kind of that mental health frame, it's also an obsessive compulsive disorder. The obsessive part is the thinking about it. The compulsion is the acting on the thought. So this preoccupation is starting to show what's coming next. Everything's starting to revolve around it. Not completely yet. This is where, again, and I hate to use it, it's a beat-up old kind of sexist cliche, but everybody knows it. When we start getting to this is where we start to separate the men from the boys. When we start getting down to these symptoms here, we start to see where that gap is getting wider and wider. Social drinkers certainly can do this occasionally. Alcoholics start to do it every time he or she picks up. When you start to get down here, there may be that occasional, but the occasions are few and far between. Not maybe like up here. But like I said, when we start to get down here and we're about to go in to the middle stage of all this, then again, all bets are off. When we get to middle stage, social drinkers never experience anything beyond this line. Everything after that, again, like I said, when somebody says, well, it's not a problem because, and that, and we'll get to that in a minute. The last one that I want to mention with this, with early stage, is a secret irritation when somebody discusses the drinking. Social drinkers, casual drinkers, may have, if somebody comes up to them and says, you know what, you're hitting it kind of hard, or boy, you made an ass out of yourself last night, or whatever it might be. Usually they blow it off and say, well, so are you. Or they kind of, I'm not drinking any more than you or anybody else. For the person who's about to cross over that boundary, about to cross over the line into active middle stage addiction, because this is still addiction, okay, for the alcoholic. It's just some social drinkers exhibit some of these as well. When we get down here, it's a whole different situation, because now it becomes an affront. Now it becomes a how dare you mention that to me. I will never forget when I first went into treatment. It's a strange thing. I would mention for years before I got sober to the right people. Never really mentioned it to the family, but I would tell people I was alcoholic because it was almost a thing to hide behind. You know, oh, honey, I lost another job. It's what drunks do, you know, that kind of thing. I would tell anybody that would hold still I had a drinking problem, that I was alcoholic, until I went into treatment. I remember the first couple of meetings I went to before I finally realized I had a problem. I had no problem whatsoever saying, hi, I'm John, I'm an alcoholic. And I said it because it's what everybody else was saying. It's what I thought everybody wanted to hear. And I thought if I didn't say it, they were going to meet me in the parking lot and, you know, beat some sense into me. So you bet, I have a problem. I'm John, I'm an alcoholic. I said it, but I didn't believe it. I admitted it, but I didn't accept it. Those things are light years apart. It starts with the admission, but that's what it is. It's the beginning of everything. So here, I'll never forget, first night I'm in treatment, my counselor says, John, why don't you tell everybody why you're here? Or why don't you introduce yourself? And I said, well, you just did. You just told them who I am. She said, you know what? I said, well, I'm John. Good to see everybody. She said, tell them why you're here. I said, well, probably the same reason everybody else is here. Because I knew in the back of my mind what she was digging at, and I just refused. I'm Irish and hard-headed. I'm one of those, again, another great old Father Martin line. I'm CIA, I'm Catholic, Irish, alcoholic. So I got a stubborn streak a mile long. So there was that. I'm not going to say what she wants me to say. I'm the same reason everybody else is here. Well, there was one old guy in group he was the old timer in the group. He'd been sober about 2 weeks. And he said, John, he said, it's been a while since I had a drink. Why don't you remind me why I'm here? I said, well, you're probably here like the rest of us. And he said, well, why am I? I said, well, you probably, okay, I have a drinking problem. He said, how bad? I said, bad enough to get me here. And I knew they were just goading me, trying to say that god-awful A word. I couldn't say the word alcoholic to save my life. And when it finally came out, I almost puked. And the reason it had that effect, all those other times I'd make comments about, oh, yeah, you know, I probably do have a problem and that kind of. I was terrified that it might be true. When I finally said it and meant it, it was like, okay, the jig's up. This is the deal. It's not a phase you're going through. It's not if you had my wife, my kids, my job, my neighborhood, you know, my dog, my whatever. The problem was I had a drinking problem and I'm alcoholic. And when people reminded me about it, it irritated me. A lot of people get labeled with denial. And sometimes I think, certainly a lot of us, it becomes a survival skill for a lot of us. But I think denial also, sometimes people are accused of that when it's something else. One of the biggest problems that people have early when they finally make a decision that it's a problem, when I finally said, yep, I'm alcoholic, the thing that kept me from doing that, going to treatment, stop playing the game, was when people would tell me I had a problem, I had to come up with all these reasons why it wasn't, and that's in the middle stage. We call that the rationalization phase, and that's exactly what it is. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So here I'm having to come up with all these reasons why it's not a problem, why it is a problem, you know, on and on and on. Because down in the, you know, kind of the bottom of my heart, I knew all the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times I had tried to quit. Just stop. Again, like I said earlier, you know, that's it, I quit, no more. God, get me out of this. I'll never do this again. 2 hours later, I'm too drunk to go to work. You know, the whole package that goes with that. The hundreds and hundreds of times that I had failed, nobody saw that but me. That was between me and God. My family may or may not have known about it. I'm not sure they did. But that was me. Now, all of a sudden, based on that past history of 900 failures, and now I'm admitting to people in public that I have a problem. First thing popped into my mind was now I have to fail in public. Now everybody's going to know about my failure. And I think that's one of the biggest detractors for people. I do a workshop where we talk about relapse, the 7-letter dirty word. Well, there's another 7-letter dirty word that goes along with that, and that's failure. And for so many people, failure becomes personalized. It's not that the person failed to follow directions, failed to stay sober. All of a sudden, it becomes a personal attack that if you failed, then you are a failure. And the easiest way to not have to deal with that is what problem? Okay? We'll see that when we get into the next piece of this, where we talk about the rationalization phase. I'll mention it right now, and then when we start the next segment, I'll mention it again. Rationalization is a defense mechanism, and it's a perfectly normal coping strategy. Problem is, addicts take, of whatever flavor we might be, we take the normal coping defense mechanisms, twist them into justifications to use. Denial's kind of the queen mother. That's the big one. Everybody knows about that. Then under that, there's a lot of variations, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But rationalization is basically an unreasonable reason for doing whatever it is you're doing. Denial says, I'm not doing it, don't drink, don't use, don't whatever. Rationalization is where the person says, well, yeah, I do, but here's why. Okay? And there's a whole other story goes with that, and we'll save that for the next segment. So in the next piece, we'll take a look at middle stage symptoms. And like I said, all the stuff that we looked at here doesn't disappear in the person's life. This gets dragged in to the middle stage stuff, and this stuff's intensified. So not only do we have the new stuff, we got the old stuff that's gotten worse. And then in late stage, we got all that, and all that other junk gets dragged in. As a comparison to kind of end on this segment, I've always looked at, if you look at stages of addiction as luggage, early stage is like a briefcase, middle stage is like a suitcase, late stage is like a trunk, like the old steamer trunks that people used to, before you had everything on wheels. And everybody, or you've done it yourself, seen somebody struggling trying to carry one of those things. They're awkward. And, well, in addiction, what happens, you don't put your briefcase down to pick up the suitcase, put that down to pick up the trunk. What happens is you're carrying the briefcase, now you pick up the suitcase. And then in late stage, you're picking up the trunk, so now you've got all of them. Not only are you carrying that new weight, you're carrying all the old junk. Problem is, addicts are notorious for saying, I can hardly handle what I have. I know what'll fix this. Throw another bag on top. Put something else on top. I can't handle this. Watch me work. Okay? If you go to meetings, and I know I said we were going to, this is one other little piece. If you go to meetings, if you work in a 12-step program, the second part of a second step says it all, because it talks about a restoration to sanity. The insanity that we talk about is not the clinical version. The insanity that we talk about is expecting different results from the same behavior. The last 100 times I tried to pick this load up, I dropped it. But by God, 101, that's going to be the time. Well, and then 102, I'm going to expecting different results from the same behavior. I think Albert Einstein's the one that actually coined that definition of insanity, and AA picked it up over the years, and it's a very important, because again, the difference between the social drinker and the alcoholic. The social drinker says, if I do this and I get this, if I don't want this to happen, I'm not going to do this. Person says, when I do this, I get this. If I don't want this to happen, I'm not going to do this. There's cause and effect. The alcoholic says, every time I do this, I get this. If I don't want this to happen, I need to do more of this. And we get stuck in that vicious cycle. Again, the word addiction comes from the Latin word addictus, that means all-consuming. Okay? The more I drank, the worse things got. The worse things got, the more I drank. And the more I drank, the worse they, on and on, becomes this self-fulfilled prophecy. So, again, in the third segment, we'll take a look at the rationalization phase or middle stage, and we'll see what shows up there. So, see you in a few. I want to thank you for being here for this last segment, and before we finish, I'd like for you to take advantage now of the assessment tool that we had spoken about.